Great, thank you so much. It's great to be part of this science seminar. And of course, I would have much preferred to present in person, meet with you directly, face to face, as well as visit beautiful Brisbane, but at least it saves a bit on the jet lag as I'm located in Montreal, Canada. So today I'd like to talk to you about research that I'm quite passionate and enthusiastic about, research on human-animal relations. And I started this line of work for theoretical reasons because as Tarly was saying, I've been investigating intergroup relations, human motivation, self and identity and well-being, and many of those theories, many of those concepts actually apply quite well to understand our relationship with other animals. Now, that's the theoretical reason. The less official reason why I started this line of work is that we had a dog named Elsie. She was a black lab. And she was so mischievous that I had no choice but to pay great attention to her. And this led me to learn about dogs, but also to think more broadly about the role that animals have in our lives and how present those relationships are in our lives actually as well. So there are three messages I'd like to convey today. And the first is that human-animal relations are ubiquitous and important to human life. And I'd like, secondly, to raise a paradox with you, the idea that biologically, we humans are animals, but we really differ in our perceptions of acknowledging and belonging to this very broad social identity. And I'd like to show and present data showing how theories of intergroup relations and social identification help to capture the part of the human identity that we share with other animals. So when starting this line of work, actually when reading, looking at the scientific literature, I actually discovered an entire field of research dedicated to human-animal relations. And psychological theories were really useful to understand those relations. At the time, Broad Bastion had also been conducting research on the meat paradox, meat consumption. So we decided first to write a paper together to review the research on human-animal relations from a psychological perspective. We decided to submit that paper to Psychological Bulletin, really trying to make the case that, well, this is an important field of study and research, and it's worthwhile to really investigate those relations from a scientific perspective. So when starting to write this paper, of course, I could have talked about Elsie, but I'm not sure that the PsychBull readership would have really appreciated that. So instead, we needed arguments, right, to say why human-animal relations are important. And the first is that they're ubiquitous. They're everywhere. When we begin to pay attention, we realize, for instance, pet ownership is normative in many countries. A majority of people in Canada, in Australia, in the US, for example, live with at least one pet. Now, at an entire different level, there's an inordinate number of animals that we eat. It's roughly estimated that 70 billion land animals were killed each year for food. There's also the animals who work alongside humans. For example, during COVID, dogs have been trained to detect that particular virus. Animals are present in children's books for the socialization of children in arts and in sports. And as a Canadian, and as you can hear from my accent, I'm a French Canadian, I have to talk to you about ice hockey, right? Our national sport, ice hockey. And there's a very prestigious hockey league in North America, the National Hockey League. And I did the count just for fun. And there's roughly a bit more than 30% of all the teams of the National Hockey League who have an animal either as an emblem or for their name as well. So human-animal relations are ubiquitous, but they're also consequential. They have a concrete impact on our human lives. And very often our relationship with pets will come to mind. It's covered, there's a current zeitgeist that pets contribute to human health and well-being. Now, scientifically, this is contested. This is not an empirical, this is not something that all studies find, but still there's some very robust experimental evidence showing how the presence of a pet can lower stress, can buffer against stress responses, and pets do so even more than the presence of our own spouse. So that's interesting. Now, the presence of an animal can facilitate our relationship with other humans. In that sense, pets act as social lubricants of interpersonal relationship between humans, and even as social capital. And you might have experienced that when walking your dog or going to the dog park. There's actually small communities forming around our pets as well. Now, even at the intergroup level, there's an impact. For example, when people are asked to think about the similarities that animals share with humans, this raises people's moral concerns for other animals, but it even lowers prejudice towards human outgroups, such that this very broad and inclusive mindset has implication even for how we perceive human social groups. So the impacts are quite deep and at different levels as well. Now, for me, human-animal relations and reading about all this literature raised one particular question, others as well, but I'll focus on one today, namely, what ties us to other animals psychologically? What's the nature of the psychological link that unites us to other animals? And in the anthrozoological literature, James Serpell talked about this connection in the sense of the animal within. So through our relationship, through our connection to other animals, namely pets, this can actually reunite us, reconnect us with something very deep within ourselves, something that's part of our biological heritage as well, and the fact that we've interacted with other animals for thousands of years. And what I'd like to show you is if we turn to theories of intergroup relations, we might have hints into the nature of this psychological link and this psychological connection. And we might also have some possible solutions for how to create more mutually beneficial relationships. And this particular social question, I have to say, is embedded within a broader social movement that there's an increasing number of people who recognize the rights of animals, as well as our human interdependence with other animals, with other species. But at the same time, in parallel, there is also, we observe some increased polarization of attitudes towards different social issues that also concern animals. If we think about climate change or urgency, for instance, this has direct implications for different animal species, endangered species, for instance. The current COVID-19 pandemic is hypothesized, we don't know for sure yet, but it's hypothesized to originate from a zoonose, so an illness that was passed on from an animal to a human. And then in terms of meat consumption, we see still some prejudice towards people depending on the type of diet that they'll adopt. So all that to say is that intergroup relations are quite useful to understand those relationships more broadly as well. So, to my knowledge, Scott Plous was really the first to apply those theories in the realm of human-animal relations. He proposed that us versus them dynamic can also operate between animals and humans. And there were different researchers in different fields of studies who have shown that in-group bias in favor of humans over other animals exists in the form of species, for instance, or in the form of preferring to save human lives over animal lives in moral dilemmas. So the question is also, how can we humans identify with animals as a very large and inclusive social group? And what are the implications of this sense of identity, both for animals and for fellow humans? So we might have some seeds of solution through this particular lens. So we're using the definition of social identification, social identity as referring to the part of the self-concept that derives from belonging to social groups. And some very large subordinate identities have been investigated, including the human identity. But when we started that line of work, Brock and I, there was not any research looking even beyond broader group that encompasses all animals. And we know social identities are very abstract, they're in our minds, but they have concrete consequences. So if we get to identify with animals, this is likely to have concrete and possibly positive consequences for other animals. And to illustrate those possible consequences, I'd like to show you this quote from the great ethologist Frans de Waal, who proposed that to the extent that we consider the other, namely other animals, as part of the self, and that we feel one with the other, then improving their life automatically resonates with us. And to illustrate those different ways we can see humans relative to other animals, let me show you a picture here. And in the part of the picture on the left here, we see that animals and humans are represented as two very distinct and non-overlapping groups. So a person who would perceive animals and humans in that way would likely not be so pro-socially inclined towards other animals. In contrast, in the part of the picture here on the right, we see that the very large and inclusive subordinate identity of animals encompasses the subgroups of non-human animals and humans. Those subgroups are still distinct, right? Because we're referring to different species, but because they're encompassed, they're included within the broad subordinate identity of all animals, the consequences are likely to be more positive and pro-social for even non-human animals. And let's not forget, biology theories assume that we are animals, right? We are a member of the kingdom of animals. We are mammals. We are primates. However, we know that people differ in their subjective perceptions of being an animal and of belonging to this biological and very large category. So this is why social psychology becomes so interesting, right? To capture those subjective perceptions. So when Brock and I first started this line of work on identification with animals per se, it's maybe a bit funny to say, but it just felt very intuitive to focus on one particular dimension of identification, namely the solidarity dimension. The items from the Leach scale really adapted quite well to this particular dimension, and we also developed additional items. We define solidarity with animals as representing one psychological bond with, so really this psychological connection we can have with other animals. It involves a commitment to, but also an investment towards other animals. And here's an overview of the first series of 8 studies. Those were relatively simple studies. The findings you'll see are quite intuitive as well. So I'm visually representing what we found in this first series of studies. So basically, the higher people's solidarity with animals, the more positive outcomes for animals themselves. So higher solidarity with animals was associated with lower speciesism, lower use of justification for using animals for human purposes. It was also associated with lower bias in favor of humans over animals, but higher moral concerns for animals and higher collective actions intention to act on behalf of animals. Now, because solidarity with animals is this very inclusive identification, it's probably very flexible, pro-social. It might relate to personality disposition that are also very inclusive and very flexible. And indeed, what we found in the pick box that we see here is that the higher people's solidarity with animals, the greater their dispositional empathy and the higher their openness to experience. Now, what about intergroup relations? Does the way we conceive and perceive other animals has implication even for how we perceive groups of humans? And because solidarity involves, it's quite a relational dimension, it's quite inclusive, less likely to be hierarchical, we expected it should relate to lower prejudice, even towards human outgroups, but and lower also rigid ideological beliefs. So we found in particular solidarity with animals was associated with lower racism, ageism, and lower RWA and lower social dominance orientation. Now, throughout this research, there are 2 subgroups of animals that I think are particularly interesting that we investigated in different studies. And those are animals that are very close to us in very different ways, the pets who we love, And the meat animals who we eat, we love them so much, we eat them, right? So we focus on those two subgroups of animals and found that the higher people's solidarity with animals, well, the greater their tendency to be a pet owner and to have a greater number of pets, suggesting solidarity is this relational caring dimension of identification. But solidarity with animals predicted a lower tendency to eat meat. So it predicted a tendency to be more vegetarian and to eat meat less frequently. But we thought, surely there's more to it than just the solidarity dimension. Surely there's other ways that people can feel identified with other animals. So basically, we went back a bit to the drawing board and we adapted 64 items of social identification coming from different established scales of social identification. And all of the items were adapted to assess identification with animals in particular. Now, there were some items that I didn't have a lot of hope for, like all animals are united. Some of them were just a bit less applicable, but were very inclusive. And this allowed us to uncover three different ways, three facets of identification with animals. Once we had uncovered those factors, we began testing their implications in study 3, the implications for outcomes that specifically concern animals. And in study 4, we looked at how the dimension predict the way that we perceive humans and animals as well. In study 5, we went back to the intergroup context to relate those dimensions to ideological beliefs. And I'll focus today particularly on studies 6 and 8, where we focus on the two subgroups of animals, namely pets and meat animals, to look at the implications for them in particular. So what we found in terms of the factorial structure of all those items is that there are three factors through which people can identify with animals. First, we replicated the solidarity dimension. It was composed of roughly the same items, but additional items were also included in that dimension, items that really tap into people's demonstration of positive behaviors towards animals. I would take, for instance, a substantial risk to rescue an animal in trouble. And the second dimension was much more cognitive. It pertained to human-animal similarity, and it involved both perceiving the self as similar to other animals, but also to perceive that humans and other animals have communality, share similarities. Finally, we uncovered a third dimension, and this was not really expected from my point of view. This dimension we called it animal pride. And this dimension actually involves a direct recognition, but also a positive evaluation of being an animal ourselves, such as I am proud to be an animal. So in study 3, we started testing the implications of those three dimensions, focusing on outcomes that specifically concern other animals. We expected that solidarity should predict those outcomes, just as it had in prior research, but probably that similarity will also predict those outcomes and more pro-sociality towards other animals, as speciesism, for instance, and animal pride as well, because, well, this dimension involves directly recognizing that we are an animal and we are hence part of this broad subordinate group. Now, what did we find? Well, solidarity was the clearest, the most consistent predictor. In this third study, it predicted lower speciesism, a lower tendency to donate hypothetical money donation to human rather than animal causes, and it also predicted greater intentions to act on behalf of other animals. Human-animal similarity did not come into play, possibly as a more cognitive dimension, but animal pride predicted higher speciesism. Now, that was not expected at all. We thought, let's dig deeper, let's collect more data to understand this finding. But still, this was very intriguing. And there's two possible explanations for that. The first is that perhaps that animal pride makes people actually let go of certain very human characteristics, like being moral, or sense of morality, or sense of responsibility towards others. And maybe that animal pride even leads people to perceive humans in more animalistic terms. Perhaps we humans are animals, hence we are more territorial, we can be more aggressive and impulsive. So we tested those propositions in studies 4 that focus on perceptions of both animals and of humans, expecting that animal pride would predict this tendency to assign animalistic traits to humans, animalistic traits like amorality, aggressivity, territoriality. In contrast, human-animal similarity should predict a tendency to perceive that humans and animals share valued characteristics like intelligence and sensory abilities. And solidarity with animals was expected to predict a great desire to help animals, but really a strong desire in the form of wanting to save endangered species, contact government to really act further on behalf of animals, because it's quite a relational and quite invested dimension. Now, what did we find is that solidarity with animals, it indeed predicted this greater desire to help other animals. It also predicted greater mind attribution, a more cognitive dimension, and human-animal similarity did predict the more cognitive variables, perceiving that humans and animals share characteristics, as well as greater mind attribution, as well as a tendency to assign typically and valued human traits to animals, like those traits of civility, maturity, for example. Animal pride did predict this tendency to instead to assign animalistic traits to humans, and it also predicted a lower desire to help animals in line with the speciesism findings. So we're beginning to paint a picture for those three dimensions. So in study 5, we went back to the intergroup context and thinking we'll push all that further by testing in particular, does animal pride lead people to be more competitive, to be more self-interested in protecting, their own interests, their own proximal interests. So we expected animal pride would lead people to endorse more competitive intergroup orientation, namely in the form of nationalism and social dominance orientation. It's like if animal pride was leading people to adopt a kind of dog-eat-dog worldview. In contrast, for solidarity with animals, we expected this dimension to predict lower social dominance orientation in line with the prior findings. And what we found is that indeed solidarity with animals predicted lower SDO, whereas animal pride predicted higher nationalism and higher SDO, social dominance orientation as well. Okay. So for study 6, we're going back to the context of pets and meat animals. Now I'm presenting here above a picture of a Dalmatian dog. I'll show you other pictures of dogs a bit later in the presentation. And here also is a picture of a cow. This picture was actually taken in Italy. I was cycling with my husband, and we saw this cow, and I was looking at her waiting, and you know, cows are quite curious, but are also shy. But this cow walked towards me, and she's just such a beautiful animal. I took a picture, and it also reminds us that traveling, we'll be able to travel quite freely and with less complication in the very near future. So for study 6, we focused on contacts with pets, in particular positive and frequent contacts with pets, thinking solidarity should predict those more positive and frequent contacts. We also assessed meat avoidance for moral and ecological concerns, as well as ambivalence towards meat eating. Again, solidarity should predict those outcomes, because as a way to shore concerns towards meat animals in particular. But perhaps human-animal similarity will also predict greater meat avoidance and greater ambivalence towards meat eating, because if we're similar to other animals, this is likely to make us more uncomfortable eating beings who are actually quite close to us. Now, what we found is that solidarity with animals predicted indeed higher contacts, higher positive and frequent contacts with pets. It predicted greater meat avoidance for moral concerns as well as greater ambivalence towards meat eating. Human-animal similarity did predict also greater meat avoidance, both for moral and ecological concerns, and animal pride did not predict those outcomes. Now I'm jumping right to the study 8 that also focused on pets and meat animals, those two important subgroups of animals. And actually in the submission process, the submission of this paper, a reviewer made a very interesting suggestion to merge the data sets from the 7 studies, because actually in all of those studies, we had questions about pet ownership, whether people have a pet or not, the number of pets who live with them, as well as meat consumption. So we could aggregate the data and test the association between the 3 dimensions and those very concrete yet very important outcomes, right? Deciding what to eat and taking care of a pet takes place on a daily basis. Now, this was not a representative sample, but we still had some pretty good statistics that align quite well with the number of pets in the US and the number of vegetarians versus omnivores. Now, in terms of pet ownership, what we found is that solidarity with animals actually predicted a higher probability of being a pet owner compared to a non-pet owner, and it predicted a greater number of pets who live with people at home. Again, confirming that this dimension is a relational dimension of identification. It involves caring for other animals, in particular, the pets who are present in our lives. In terms of meat consumption, we found that solidarity with animals was again a consistent predictor. It predicted a greater probability of being a vegetarian or a vegan rather than a meat eater, and it predicted a lower number of portions of meat on average per week. Now, there was also a marginal association that emerged. It wasn't significant, but in this large data set, it's quite interesting to note. So animal pride predicted a greater tendency to eat meat, a greater number of portions of meat. And basically, this association could be due to the fact that if we recognize and if we value being an animal ourselves, and well, animals do eat meat themselves too, then this might justify the consumption of meat, and it could explain this particular association. So just to recap the findings, now I've put some pictures here just to also illustrate what those findings represent to me. So for solidarity with animals, I put a picture here of me and Elsie that's following a canine race, a canicross race. That's actually very close to Quebec City. That's the part of the St. Lawrence River where the water is becoming salty. So probably your dogs in Australia are really used to the salty water, but Elsie, it was her first time. So you can maybe see her little tongue there being surprised by the water. So solidarity with animals represents this psychological bond and commitment and investment. So those efforts invested in the human-animal relation. Now, for human-animal similarity, we focus a lot in this research on the cognitive similarities that we recognize between animals and humans. But there's also all those physiological similarities that are very important too. So I put a picture here of a man sharing a drink with an elephant in this case. And for animal pride, well, this dimension of identification captures a more competitive dimension, the fact that we human also possess animalistic traits. Now, viewing animals as territorial and aggressive is just part of the story, right? Because when we look at the ethological literature, we know those are more stereotypes of animals. Animals can also display empathy, but it seems that animal pride really tapped into this vision of humans sharing those more animalistic and stereotypical traits. So coming full circle, I hope I've convinced you that human-animal relations are ubiquitous and important to human life, that we are animals, but we differ in our perceptions, in the way that we conceive of our psychological links with other animals, namely through the 3 dimensions that we uncovered in this research, and that theories of intergroup relations and social identification help to get at, to capture and assess this part of the human identity that we share with animals. So where to from here? Definitely, I am very interested in pushing further the role of pets in human lives, and the question also of whether pets can serve as a springboard for broader concerns for other groups of animals, and also for nature, perhaps. So this is research that we're pushing forward at the moment as well. Definitely, all those associations need to be tested cross-culturally. We had put forward hypotheses in the prior papers, but this needs to be tested very systematically as well. And there's also really neat work that I'm involved, worked with Emma Thomas and Winifred on collective actions that involve other animals. And this is really timely research and important at the moment too. And finally, I'm very interested in the role of status and power dynamics that also operate in human-animal relations. Those perceptions, those differences are currently also being contested. So I think it's going to be really important to understand those phenomena better. I'd like to thank my great colleagues with whom I've worked, who have encouraged this line of work, contributed to it as well as the students and staff over the years, some of whom have played a really important role are listed here. I think the funding agencies who have supported this work continuously over the years. At a completely different level, I think Elsie and George here represented in the Canadian winter. And this is not a Dalmatian, this is a German short hair pointer. His name is Enzo, our young dog, very energetic and continuing to inspire this work. So I thank you very much. I'll be happy to take questions.